Why do we play video games? Can violent games cause real-world aggression? And when does a gaming habit become an addiction? Hello and welcome to the Wired UK Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Vicki Turk, and joining me today are Matt Burgess.
Hello.
And Matt Reynolds.
Hello.
This month we've been reading Lost in a Good Game by Pete Etchells. It's a book about the psychology of why we play video games and what they do for us, and perhaps to us even, based on Etchells' work as a psychologist focused on video games research. What did you guys make of the book?
I really enjoyed it, actually. And I think the reason is that, play some video games, but I feel that the conversation around video games has not been very nuanced in public. It's often seen as a thing that, younger people do, and maybe it's making people violent, or maybe it's a waste of time, or maybe they're getting addicted. And it was really nice to hear a kind of very clear-headed, rational look at video games, but also from someone that really cared. Pete talks about the death of his father and like other kind of life events, and actually he makes video games feel very real and tangible, and actually he talks about the kind of benefits you can get from that, whether that's looking for emotional solace or finding friends. So it was very nice. He had some science, emotion. It hit a lot of buttons for me.
Yeah, Pete obviously really cares about sort of video games, and he is obviously a professor and researcher into this area. And I think that sort of comes across. You can tell that he sees it not just as a hobby, but also not just as research, but also as a hobby as well. So he is particularly really informed and passionate about the subject. And to be honest, I sort of really enjoyed it. And I'm not the most sort of culturally a gamer essentially, or haven't been for the last decade, and I thought it was really accessible from that perspective. I didn't think that I was going into it. I was a little bit like, this is going to be quite a tough read. I think it could be quite dry. It could be quite difficult to get into and too gamey. But I definitely didn't find that in any sort of way at all.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was certainly expecting the kind of objective research about video games angle, and I was excited to learn about that. But I think what really made it was that really personal, subjective approach too. So Pete obviously grew up playing video games. They were an important part of his growing up, dealing with events in his own life, and then decided to research them. And I think he kind of melds the two in quite a good way, where he doesn't seem too biased when he's talking about the research or anything. Like, he approaches that very scientifically, but he's also sharing his personal story, and especially how video games became almost a coping mechanism for him after his father's death, which I think kind of highlights one of his key points in the book, which is why we play games. It's not necessarily just a kind of leisure pursuit. It's not just passing the time. There's many different things that might motivate people to play. And for him, that was quite personal. Let's talk about some of those other reasons. Do you guys play games? Why? What do you play and why?
I dabble. So I am probably your most mainstream games consumer. So I will basically play any game that has been very popular and talked about in the last year. So thinking over the last couple of years, that means I've played Red Dead Redemption 2, Horizon Zero Dawn, God of War. So I am just so straight down the line AAA. I have been playing quite a lot of Minecraft recently, which has actually been great because obviously it's a very open-ended game. There's not really a point. You just kind of bring to it what you want. And that's actually been brilliant because it kind of scratches a bit of an itch that I don't really explore. But actually a couple of days ago I had a bad experience with a skeleton archer, and I lost a bunch of diamonds I'd mined, and I put it away. I was like, I can't be doing this now.
Why do you like those games? Like, what makes you think, okay, I'm going to sit down and play now?
What, you mean games like the kind of AAA games, or a game like Minecraft?
Well, either. Is it different?
Well, honestly, because I just feel that, this is kind of a stupid... It reflects poorly on me, but I'm, kind of interested in gaming, but there are so many bad games, and also when you start a game, I just have to finish it. So I just think, I'm only going to try and pick the ones that I can be fairly sure are kind of well-regarded and most people like them. So I typically just follow the crowd. I let them find out what the good games are, and then 2 months later, I'm like, oh yeah, that game that everyone said was good. It was good.
Did you actually get to the end of Red Dead Redemption then?
No, I'm still in it. I'm putting some time away this weekend because I am enjoying it a lot more, but it's just it's so much time, and I think that, and kind of Pete kind of gets into this actually, that games can seem like they're kind of absorbing and otherworldly because people seem to be in a different world for 6 hours or whatever where they're playing it. And I think that's kind of part of the problem, because I have that that mentality sometimes, well, what did I get out of this time? It's not like I learned something from a book, but that's actually me maybe bringing a bit of negativity to the gaming process, and I've maybe been a bit influenced by the type of narrative around that, and it makes me think, oh, maybe it's not worth playing that. But I think this has made me think, actually, it's kind of worthwhile just doing it anyway.
Yeah, I'm very much in that same camp as like a populist gamer, but I'm a populist gamer from a decade and a half ago, roughly. So I think my earliest gaming memories are playing things very much on the PlayStation 1 and early PlayStation 2. Like the games that particularly stick out to me would be James Bond 007 Nightfire. A game that I used to play quite a lot with friends, which is one of the main reasons for playing it, just socially, all of us just shooting each other, playing around in the same world. Things like Crash Bandicoot, lots of sports games, like FIFA and tennis and the Olympics. I used to play a lot of like the button bashing Olympic games, when it's just like, press X and circle on the PlayStation controller and just bash them until you win the race or something like that. And then even possibly before that, which I've only just remembered, is like I used to play those very similar sort of games at my nan's house when she bought some of the very earliest sort of consoles. I can't even remember what they were, but it was like Alex the Kid was a game, and you would drive in this little like guy around worlds collecting things and trying to beat some bosses, and it was just very much like flat on the screen, left to right, side scrolling playing game. But like in the last decade, I probably haven't played as many sort of big popular games. I've dabbled a little bit with the most recent things coming out, but it's more just at the moment to spend a bit of time doing something different.
Yeah, it's interesting because I only play a few games, but they're very different titles. And I can really relate to what Pete was saying about the different reasons we play games, because I think I play them all for different things. So I'm really into, as you know, Player Unknown's Battlegrounds, which is kind of like Fortnite. It's a first-person shooter. Last one, 100 of you drop on an island, and the last one to be alive at the end is the winner. So it's very kind of, I guess you'd say, it's quite a violent game. You have to kill other people. It's quite stressful. It's very tense. It's very competitive. I'm not very good at it. But I definitely approach that with kind of a competitive frame of mind and like really trying to improve my skills in the game. But then on the other hand, I also play Zelda Breath of the Wild, which is much more open exploration. And that for me is much more about escapism and just like taking in this beautiful fantasy world. And then things like Mario Kart is really a social experience for me. Again, I'm not particularly good. I do get quite competitive on it. But it's about spending time with friends, even if they're not necessarily in the same room. Like I've got a WhatsApp group for Mario Kart players, and if enough people want to play at the same time, then we'll kind of get on and have a game. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting sort of highlighting the different things that games can do for us. And even the same game. So Pete mentions World of Warcraft, which he obviously plays a lot, and that you can play it in loads of different ways.
Yeah, I think that's really important, this idea that games can actually serve different needs to different people at different times. So it can be kind of therapy, it can be something to retreat into and build your own worlds and kind of, work through your feelings there maybe, or it can be a really social thing. And actually it feels to me that's something that's not really talked about in our public conversation around games, right? They're seen in a very one-dimensional way. But actually, like Pete says, even the idea of who is a gamer is much more open than we think it is, right? So if I bet a lot of our listeners, they've picked up Candy Crush, right? They've played some kind of free-to-play game. They might not identify themselves as a gamer, but it's exactly the same kind of mechanisms and things going on. And I wonder if we have quite a kind of a myopic view when we usually use the term gamer.
You can certainly tell that he's a bit frustrated with sort of that stereotype that's quite often comes across when people are, like you say the word gamer, people will have something that comes into their minds that they think of straight away. And you can really tell that it's something that he thinks is like really just negatively portrayed in the media. And essentially probably everybody is a gamer in some sort of way, whether it is somebody that's played Farmville on Facebook for years or that plays more of the sort of titles that we would think as a core games as they were.
Yeah, it's funny, even sort of even today when everyone does play games, you kind of hear the word gamer and you think of sort of teenage boy in a basement playing Call of Duty, when obviously that's just not the reality for so many people. So Pete Etchells is obviously a psychologist, and a lot of the book is addressing what we know from psychology research about the effects of gaming, which is, and addressing some of those stereotypes, often negative, about the impact of video games. And one of those biggest questions is around violent video games and do they make people aggressive in real life? What did you kind of take away from his analysis there?
Well, I think the point he makes, and he makes it in a really kind of reasoned and clear-headed way, is that it's really difficult to get useful results from these experiments because they are so dependent on how you set them up. So, they're talking about, how do you even infer violence? Well, he talks about some examples where you're talking about people, I think they're making a sandwich and they change the heat levels of chilies they're putting into the sandwich to give to this kind of unknown person that's coming in the experiment after them. And the idea being, well, if you're going to give them a hotter chili, you're probably feeling more violent. There might be other ways of asking people to assess their own violence. Are people able to say, do I feel more violent now? Am I more likely to respond angrily? You can talk about surveys and things like that. And I think he does a really good job of setting up this kind of paradigm where he's saying, look, it's really difficult getting these results in the first place. And more than that, they're very, very biased depending on what you might get out. So he talks through all these things, ways about how you can kind of manipulate not only methodology, but how you kind of analyze these results if you're trying to bend towards one thing or another thing. And I think that my main takeout of that is it's so much more, nebulous and kind of difficult to drill down into. So it's very, very hard to draw clear conclusions, especially when science is kind of incentivized to produce a very clear paper that says, yes, this is a thing, or no, this is not a thing, and also is incentivized to produce a result that people want to talk about, gets people talking, a result like games cause violence. And actually maybe a study that said, it's kind of a bit of both and it's maybe not that clear. The system isn't really set up to produce those kind of results, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, essentially for me as well, this really highlighted some of the sort of frustrations that there are with research around all areas of gaming, not just aggression. But Pete pretty much goes into sort of a breakdown of a lot of issues with how studies are conducted and how they are essentially sort of the results they produce are very much meant for the media in some cases, and how all of these systems are really quite difficult to understand what the subtle complexities, because gaming is a relatively new phenomenon sort of through the last 50, 60, 70 years, and very little research has been done around it that is sort of builds up a big body of evidence. And he seems to sort of say that, yes, in a lot of these occasions, there may be some sort of causational evidence to actually make sure that some of these claims are true, but we just really don't know because the studies have been conducted very badly. They've been done very haphazardly in some ways, and there's a lack of quality of evidence across every single area that he talks about in the book. And I think that you can tell that he is probably a little bit frustrated with how the media portrays things as well, particularly gaming, with the idea of every time that there is a big a terrorist incident or a mass murder or something like that, there's occasionally stories that go into the press that are saying it's gaming's fault. And yeah, he doesn't like that, does he?
Yeah, it's funny actually. I didn't really expect this from the book. Obviously he explains about video game research, but it's also showing the problems with psychology research full stop. And psychology is in kind of a real crisis at the moment. There's the replication crisis where people are struggling to replicate the results of old psychological studies, which is then throwing the conclusions into doubt. And there's lots of sort of, he emphasizes that psychology is a very new field and there aren't really very set methods to follow to do good experiments, and it's still sort of everyone's learning. And when you kind of try to draw too larger conclusions from one probably flawed study, that's when things go really wrong. So you mentioned obviously it's very difficult to measure aggression in a controlled study because you can't go and, see if people are going to go and fight each other or something. So they have all these analogues like, play someone a loud noise, and if you play it louder, you're more aggressive. But is that really aggressive? Who knows? And even defining a video game, he points out, is really difficult. And defining a violent video game, I like the bit where he references one study that tried to classify violent games, and the most violent game ended up being the arcade game Centipede, just because of the way the researchers were classifying what counted as an aggressive act. And most people would say, that's definitely not really an aggressive game at all. So it's just obviously so difficult to do research in this area. And then you've got all the problems of researchers either consciously or unconsciously potentially introducing bias into their results, either by interpreting the data in a specific way that gives the answer that people might want, but not necessarily the most objective or real answer, and things like deciding to exclude certain people from the experiment as anomalies just because their results don't match what works, and all kinds of different techniques, not to mention more common tricks like, presenting correlation as causation. That's another kind of issue that plagues these discussions. I think he does quite a job of debunking the more hyperbolic claims about aggressive video games and, whether they cause real world violence, while also saying, look, to be honest, this doesn't mean they don't. We just really don't know. And you can definitely sense his frustration that this is still a question because the question's been asked so many times. People have attempted to answer it so many times, and yet there's still no definitive or even slightly clear sort of evidence for anything. And it's kind of just a sense of, can we move on now?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you get all kinds of situations where there might be a high school shooter in America, and then you look back in their history, and it turns out they played video games. And that's where people start to bring up these links. But actually, you can counter that with lots of different types of evidence. The overall level of violence in society has been declining during the period that video games are, become popular. So is there certain types of violence? Is it kind of overall violence? Does it push people that are perhaps more likely to commit some kind of act? Does it push them over the edge? Does it change the type of weapons people might use or access? There are lots of valid approaches, but it's a lot more, it's more of a nuanced issue than video games make you violent. And it's just like the same debate we had over, horror movies or video nasties or rap music. And it's just the kind of same thing. And I think the reason why it's so pervasive is it's a really easy narrative. And to people that don't play games and you're watching someone play a violent video game, it seems so obvious, and so shocking. And it's very much a situation of often you get people kind of outside that world commenting on what's happening within it. It's just more surprising that actually, and Pete talks about this, just how widespread gaming is, yet our level of conversation is so poor around it as well. There's this real disjunct because people think, oh, gaming is something someone else does, but actually it's something that more people are not engaged with.
Yeah, I thought it was quite interesting as well. He didn't quite tease it out as much as I would have liked, but in a few places there were references to sort of parenting and how people are from generations that haven't necessarily gamed or won't consider themselves as gamers, and how they deal with their kids when they are actually when they're sitting playing for games for long hours, don't want to stop playing them. I think it's probably something that I experienced as a child in that situation, didn't want to stop playing Crash Bandicoot or whatever. And it would be nice to sort of see how to sort of expand that discussion a little bit wider, and if that will change when people who have grown up with games are becoming parents as well, and their sort of understanding around how these massive moments in our lives do affect people, and how they should handle their kids, and when they don't want to stop playing. And it's will the sort of narrative change basically in a generational shift, which I think it probably will, but it is a bit hard to say.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because without the clear evidence base, it's hard to give sort of solid advice to parents or teachers or whoever's sort of trying to deal with this, especially when you're talking about children. Obviously everyone cares about children's welfare, and so this seems quite an important issue, which brings us on to another common complaint around video games, especially at the moment with Fortnite: addiction. Can you be addicted to video games? The World Health Organization made gaming disorder a thing, an official thing, last year. So it is sort of saying we recognize this as an issue. Pete Etchells obviously takes issue with this. He says it's too early. We don't have any evidence. We don't know what the symptoms are, what counts as just being someone who likes gaming a lot versus being someone who is actually addicted to it. How do we draw the line there? What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. And Pete kind of points out that the problem with labeling it a disorder is you might get people who are gaming and it doesn't actually interrupt their life, who kind of feel their gaming is kind of pathologized, and that maybe affects them, and so basically you overdiagnose people when maybe there isn't such a problem. And I think he kind of makes the point, and it sounds stupid and kind of basic, but if your gaming is stopping you doing the other things you would want to do in your life or that you need to do to function, then it's a problem. which I guess is broadly a description of a kind of addiction, but he kind of says, well, I don't necessarily know if it needs this kind of very specific category, because maybe you should have this slightly more holistic approach to it. I think it's a really, really interesting question, but I think, and Pete brings this up in the book, that actually what's more terrifying is the kind of low levels of addiction that you don't think about. So thinking about a free-to-play game like Candy Crush or Clash of Clans or whatever, a bunch of those. And I'm really interested in how he was talking about the mechanisms in these games are kind of like slot machines, really. They're made to randomly make you win after a certain number of times, right? That you can't predict. You might win 3 times in 5 games, and then you won't win for the next 7 games in a row. And because of that, you'll be timed out, and you might have to, pay a $5 to buy more lives. And the problem is that that's not addiction per se. It's games that are specifically designed to get you coming back. And this whole
more manipulation.
Exactly, yeah, and there's this whole concept of in the kind of free-to-play industry, they're called whales. These consumers that spend big on games, but they only make up quite a small percentage. So I think there's a statistic like 10% of the gamers of most free-to-play games make up 60% of the revenue, and they spend around £250 a month. But actually in the book, he talks about examples of one game, I think it's called Conquest, I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, it's Game of Thrones Conquest that he played.
Right, yeah. And he's talking about one player that they think spent around £13,000, and that's not a question of addiction, like you said, Matt, so much as kind of manipulation and deliberate design, really. So I find that almost more concerning than I'm addicted to a game that I pay 60 quid for and sit down and that's it.
It's interesting as well to how some of these ideas are moving beyond gaming as well. So like in recent years, we've seen more software and particularly educational things like be it going through the phase of gamification and like adopting some of the techniques of like feedback loops, reward systems, leveling up and providing people with points for educational things. And it seems like these games do get kids, well, educational software do get kids to want to play a little bit more, but it doesn't necessarily translate that they are particularly good. So I've been in some other research that I've seen and read, there's been sort of discussions around like a mathematics program in the US and essentially parents stopping their children learning too much because they're spending too much time on wanting to be playing this educational piece of software. And it's like, okay, this is these techniques that are being used from one area into another, and we don't really know like how they work and sort of the effects that they're having on people that are using them.
Yeah, for me, I think there's definitely a discussion to be had there about the line between gaming and gambling. Even that term whales, the people who spend loads of money on in-game purchases, that's borrowed from sort of casinos and the gambling world, and that's what they call the big spenders. And I think that's very telling. And it's certainly with things like loot boxes, which have become very prominent, especially in free-to-play games. I think, there's a separate discussion to be had there about whether that is fair, whether that crosses the line into gambling. Some countries have outlawed certain types of loot box, especially if you can essentially pay to get an advantage in the game. And that's something Pete highlights with Conquest, which he plays, saying, I've never paid to make progress in a game until I played this game, and I either had to wait like 24 hours to build the next bit of my castle, or I could just spend some money and do it right away. And also Hogwarts: A Mystery, that's another one that lets you do that. You can advance quicker if you pay. And I think, there's something very unsettling about that that's tied up in this question about addiction. But is gaming disorder a separate thing to what we already know about gambling? Or, what is actually happening here? Is it a specific thing related to video games, or is it related to specific mechanisms in certain video games, or is it a different behaviour that just happens to come through sometimes in this situation? Again, it's something with lots of questions and very few answers.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to the question of gaming addiction specifically, I guess the balance you want to be striking is you want people that actually do have a problem and, that it's kind of troubling and affecting their life. You want them to be able to access help. And in that regard, having gaming condition as a as an actual recognised condition by the WHO is actually useful, because you can say to the doctor, or someone can, say on your behalf or whatever, look, I think this person has this thing and it's a problem, and there's a kind of structure for perhaps dealing with it and recognising it. But you have to kind of weigh this off against this kind of problem of overdiagnosing and people being put into this box, and then it's like it causes all these problems. Like, actually, I'm using this to connect with my friends, and maybe I withdraw, or maybe I just switch to some other type of screen time, because he makes a point elsewhere in the book that there's a sense of gaming as this kind of homogenous kind of group, but actually there's lots of different ways to be using it. It might be healthier to be meeting your mates on Minecraft than playing, on your own some other game. And then actually you need to be really careful about how you talk about them, because you could start to push people away from behaviour that is actually maybe quite helpful and healthy.
I think that's the thing. A lot of our kind of general conversations around gaming almost come from a place of assuming that gaming is bad for some reason. The same with screen time in general, using social media or whatever, looking at your phone. We've almost like pathologized that as a society and said, like, this is bad. And we have this weird, naive, rose-tinted view that if we didn't have this technology, we'd be off frolicking in fields and, sniffing the flowers and whatever. And I think that's something that it's almost, that bias is quite ingrained in people. Even myself, like as someone who plays games and who is very interested in this research, you have to sort of be careful not to let that bias seep through when you see someone playing a game for a long period of time. Why is that necessarily any worse than reading a book for a few hours or watching TV? There's something about it that, has gained a bad reputation. And I'm not really sure why.
It's the media, isn't it? It's all our fault.
Is it all our fault?
It's difficult, because I think in the book, Pete kind of says there's something about the way when you watch someone playing a game, you don't understand what's going on. Like, you're not inputting the control. So you as a viewer, not the player, don't have this link to it. This person seems to be in a completely world away from you. So I think there is something maybe inherently about watching games that seems a bit like, that person's absorbed in something that seems kind of pointless. Although it's difficult, because actually to me it doesn't seem that much different from a book. It's different about me watching you read a book than actually me reading the book, but it seems that we've got this kind of innate revulsion towards games, and I think that we need to basically just grow up and kind of move away a little bit from that, because it doesn't seem that helpful.
Yeah, one of the things that I've sort of quite struck me from Pete's analysis, and this was very early on in the book, is that games are just such a different medium and have a different impact on people than other types of media, such as reading a book, watching something on TV, going to the theatre, etc. They involve you. You are an active participant, and to a certain extent, within constraints of whatever the game is, you can control what is happening around you. There may be limits around how far you can walk or how far you can move a character, but you are controlling that. You are essentially alive. You become that character in the game, and that is one of the things that is like what makes games so good, but is probably what also makes them hard to sort of understand for people that haven't played a game, because they just haven't had that experience of you have become a marsupial that is running through collecting Wumpa fruits. Like, they just don't get that. Sorry, that's the last Crash Bandicoot analogy I'm going to do.
It is funny, isn't it, how it's only really now and recently that games are being properly appreciated as a cultural medium. And I don't know why that's taken so long. It's strange. So we've gone over some of the research that Pete's been involved with, and a lot of the kind of lacking data, lacking methodology to get any clear answers on how video games affect us. I have to say, at some points in the book, when I was reading about all the problems with the research to date and all the problems with conducting psychological research, I was kind of like, is there any point? Like, how are we ever going to answer these questions? What do you think?
What, should we just not bother?
Well, I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't bother, but it seemed so hopeless at points when you're reading about all of this research that people have obviously put a lot of work and thought into, and then it's just, full of holes and problems that mean it doesn't really stand up. I mean, I guess he does. So what I really took away from it, I suppose, is that researchers need to change the way they work, because the way that it's working at the moment isn't working. So things like open science and pre-registration. So pre-registration, Pete talks about quite a lot. He's obviously a big advocate of this, is when you essentially publish what you are going to look for and how you are going to do it before you do the experiment, so that you can't then kind of manipulate your data after the fact or change your hypothesis to match it, because of this pressure to publish and to publish positive results. So it kind of makes researchers stick to the topic at hand and do it in a kind of ethical, as far as possible, strong, unbiased way.
Yeah, and I think, as I understand it, it means that also the journal that's going to publish that research commits in advance to say, you're researching a valid thing, the answer to that is valid, and not going to them and saying, oh, I found this amazing thing and it tells us the games are addictive, and they're like, great, we'll only publish that and not the stuff that says, actually, games are not addictive, or we don't know, because that's kind of unnewsworthy and not that interesting. So that makes an awful lot of sense. I also think that I wonder if part of it is a little bit of our problem, really. Maybe we need to, I'm talking about media and the way we talk about games more publicly. We need to stop positing these slightly silly questions, if you like, about whether there's this super straight link between whatever video games and violence, or those kind of things, and actually being a bit more open-minded about, well, what do brains do? Like, what do games do to us? Like, how can they help us facilitate relationships? How do they do X and Y? And maybe just starting in a slightly more with a slightly more cultural approach and saying, well, how are people using games? What are they using them to do? What role does that play in our lives? And seeing what questions arise from that, rather than doing a knee-jerk thing and trying to say, well, it seems dodgy to me. Can you find out whether it's dodgy? I wonder if we just need to be a little bit more rational and slow, and maybe it's just a bit boring.
Yeah, you're living in that perfect world, which would be better to go into. But I think that it applies across like multiple different disciplines of science as well. We're not just talking about psychology or games research. That essentially it's never going to be perfect, and that's the point of it in a way, because we're trying to build on what people have previously discovered, and that includes trying to replicate it, trying to make sure it's accurate, and then coming to conclusions which will change, because that is the nature of how these fields basically develop, and gaming and psychological research, and when they're combined, are both very new to a subject. So we will start to see like more, hopefully better work coming, but it does require like I guess a cross-tier approach, which is not the most sexy thing.
It all takes time. And we had some feedback actually from Giovanna, an avid book club reader. I recognise that name. I think Giovanna's spoken to us before. Hi, Giovanna. And she comments on this. She says, I appreciated Etchells' effort to build a theoretical framework for us to think of video games, and for the sceptical among us to do so with some seriousness and objectiveness. She says, he doesn't mention so much some of the interesting characteristics of games like production, style, narrative, gameplay. He focuses on how we get psychologically lost in a game, illustrating how this works and how it's perceived by others around us. And he angrily exposes the biases of experiments and research that are carried out under the pressure of the unthankful world of academia. I think that's really interesting, because I think, from the outside, people who aren't involved in academia kind of maybe have this impression that every study that's published is great and meaningful, and, academia is above petty fights among different groups of researchers and that sort of thing, when Pete Etchells obviously very clearly exposes that's not really the case, and academics are humans too.
Yeah, and also it's just down to thinking about simple things like how many studies you never see the results of because the experiment, the results were found and they weren't interesting and they were dropped. And I just think it's really interesting. Like you said, Vicki, you need to think about academia not as in, well, we thought about it for a long time, we did an experiment and we came up with the right answer, so much as this flawed process that maybe stuff gets through and maybe stuff is kind of rebutted, and like you're saying, there needs to be a bit more of a focus on trying to reproduce results to see if is this really true, is this really what's going on, and actually telling more of a story about, well, actually we didn't pursue this because we looked at this thing and that wasn't interesting, so that's why we steered towards this more headline grabbing aspect. So I think actually, if anything, the most interesting thing about the book is that it's kind of not about video games, it's kind of lifting the lids a little bit on actually this is the kind of slightly murky, slightly understandable stuff that goes on, that means that the narratives around these things are a little bit more complicated than you might think they are.
Yeah, that was one of my takeaways, actually, that it isn't just about games, obviously. It's about all of the different issues that sort of society has in sort of the worlds of academia, media, sort of social discussions, how we deal with emerging technologies. But you're looking at games as a lens to really sort of illustrate some of those issues. And I don't think there are any answers in the book necessarily, like really concrete ones. There are suggestions, and Pete, I don't think, would claim to have all the answers. But it will be interesting to see like where this sort of field goes next in terms of like what could be done to improve these issues.
I feel like we've been moaning about academia for quite a while now. Obviously, another part of the book, although it does have that broader relevance, you really do feel Pete's passion for games. And he mentions quite a few and describes the games that he's enjoyed playing throughout his life in lovely detail, actually. Some of them really made me want to give them a go. Did any stand out to you?
So I really like the sound of the Zelda game, Breath of the Wild.
Have you not played that?
Well, that falls into my box, really, because that was massively talked about. I should be playing that, but I don't have a Switch, so that's why. But it just sounded fantastic. This kind of, what I loved actually is that it gave a sense of, I think he's saying that Zelda is like a 30-year franchise, I think in 1988, the first game, and then it had all these kind of echoes back to earlier games, and it's all about kind of telling this history, and that's just a brilliantly rich thing. These video game franchises are, as older than like Lord of the Rings or some of these kind of storied, cultural things that we talk about, and it's really, I don't know, it just sounded kind of a fascinating world to kind of get into, and I feel like I maybe wouldn't appreciate it though, because I've not played any of those older games.
I hadn't played any of the older ones, and I really love Breath of the Wild. I think Pete actually singles it out as like the perfect game. It's his best game ever, and I can totally see that, because the world it conjures into being is just so rich. It's unbelievable. And you really feel like you do have a lot of autonomy. You can choose to play it like a fighter and battle lots of monsters and things, which I'm terrible at. Or you can spend ages just wandering around, like picking flowers and exploring and doing puzzle challenges. And none of it seems sort of, just put there for you to advance in the game. It all seems like just very realistic. Like you're really, I don't really like this term, but you're really immersed. And it's not like you feel you have to constantly complete each objective. It's much more open world. I really liked it.
It made me the book in general made me really nostalgic for the games that I used to play, and when I used to have loads of time to really immerse myself into games and spend a long time on them. It sort of made me think back to some of the early days on my Game Boys, so the big grey one, original Nintendo one, and then the Game Boy Colors, and like used to play a lot of Tetris on that original on the grey Game Boy, and then moved to I think like Pokemon Red or something like that on the Color Game Boy, and just remember spending hours, normally sat in bed, sometimes under the covers, like after my parents had told me to go to bed, just playing these games and just focusing on them and being really sort of like engrossed in what's happening to me and the characters and the Pokemon that I had. But like I just don't do that as much anymore, and that's what the book made me sort of feel in terms of like, oh, I wish I could go back and play some of these games again.
I really like the sound of Firewatch, the computer game where you are... I think for me, it kind of showed how emotionally evocative games can be. So the backstory he explains is your wife has early onset dementia. She goes away and you take a position in a Firewatch tower where you're basically just like looking out, trying to spot wildfires before they happen, and then you have to go and investigate and like solve a mystery, but it's all while kind of making these choices about how you behave, especially in regard to like another woman coming into your life and that kind of thing, and I think it just kind of underlined how, again, that stereotype of what a game is, certainly nowadays, is just not true, and there's such a variety there, and they can really tap into our emotions in different ways.
Yeah, I think another game you mentioned, was it called Last Day of June, where he's talking about this one where basically the person you're in a relationship with dies, and it's all about can you rewrite history, but actually if you try and change what happens, all this other stuff happen, like, bad things happen anyway, and I think it's told not through kind of narrative. I thought the name was maybe a little bit on the nose, like, I think the woman is called June, but I thought like, wow, that seems like, I was reading it, I was thinking, wow, that emotionally seems like such a kind of big hitter, and like you're saying, it just, there's so much more, more powerful things that kind of games can kind of bring out of us, and it's really nice to see that kind of diversity represented in the book.
So I think we all enjoyed it. A good book club choice.
Agreed.
And we'll end our discussion there, but we do have one more thing to do. We need to announce the next Wired Book Club book. Are you ready?
I'm ready. What's it going to be?
We should get like a drum roll sound effect.
Yeah, we need that. So
the next Wired Book Club book is Superior by Angela Saney, something rather different. It's about the return of race science. It's hotly anticipated after her last book, Inferior, which looked at the dodgy scientific research used to justify sexism. And this explores the horrifying revival of scientific racism, which is fueled by political groups misusing science to bolster their own racist beliefs. I am really looking forward to this one. I think it's going to be a really important read. I imagine it will be quite a challenging one in terms of subject matter, but really looking forward to getting into that. So do join us. We'll be discussing Superior by Angela Saney on the Book Club podcast in about a month's time. And there'll soon be available an extract to read on wired.co.uk.
Cool. I'm looking forward to it. That looks like a good one. It's been very hyped. Heard a lot about it. Angela Saney is an amazing writer.
She's so good. I really loved her last book. And yeah, I'm really, really looking forward to what she has to say in this one.
Yeah. So go out, get a copy, and we'll be talking about it on a later edition. As
usual, send all your feedback, thoughts, comments, reviews, whatever, to podcast@wired.co.uk. This is the first time we've done the Book Club podcast as a separate podcast to the normal Wired UK podcast. So let us know how it was. Was it awful? Was it okay? Was it brilliant?
Was it a combination? Did we go on too long? Was it boring? Should Matt Burgess come back again? Who knows?
Probably not.
Let us know, podcast@wired.co.uk, and we'll be on the Book Club podcast again next month. That's bye from me.
Bye.
Bye.